Okay, guys, we're almost there. Final session, final paper. I just want to say that when I originally planned to do the book, the plan was to do a book about the art, predominantly of Jeffery Rubinoff, partly because I didn't feel equipped to deal particularly well with the ideas. But Peter, who I always wanted to be involved in the book, was ambitiously proposed himself as the person who would deal with the ideas, and I thought it was a really tough challenge.
This is a complete misreading of history. I was persuaded, cajoled, and arm twisted
I don't remember it that way.
Somebody called James Fox.
All I remember is that when Peter's piece came in, I thought it was just a absolutely brilliant piece of work, because Jeffery has so many ideas about so many different things, and they're complex and they're carefully thought out, but they're so intertwined with lots of different other ideas, and Peter picked them apart with such brilliant and precision and clarity, and I think they made so much sense to me. So thank you, Peter, and I'll leave you to do what you do.
Thank you, James. Well, I may have picked them apart, but whether I can put them together again in any coherent form is now the problem. I'm just going to speak to the version of the chapter that many of you may have seen already if you're interested on this, but I want to pick out what seem to me to be some vital connections here, subject as always to correction from the person on my immediate right here. Now, Jeffery's work, of course, literally stands by itself in the sculpture park. These are works that speak for themselves. They communicate directly with those who view them without any need for intermediation, interpretation by anyone else, not even by the artist. And that perhaps is a contrast with many contemporary artists who feel the need to write about their own work and to explicate it, and art historians take that sort of intervention very seriously. You won't get that from Jeffery, not directly telling us what these works are about or what they're doing. Yet, Jeffery also, as I think you will all have realised by now, is a man whose head is buzzing with ideas, and these are the kind of ideas that I want to grapple with and to make sense of for myself and perhaps for others as well. And that's what I'll be talking about now. We're not trying to interpret Jeffery's sculptures in any direct sense, but the fact that he is a sculptor, the fact that he is an artist, is of course integral to the whole activity here. And we can't do better, I think, than by starting with his aphorisms that he first I saw them first brought together in what he said to the forum on Hornby Island. It's reprinted in the book Jeffery Rubinoff on Art, and it's repeated twice over. You get them at the end of what he said in 2010, I think, and then they're at the beginning of what he said in the forum in 2011. So clearly they were of considerable significance to him and remain so. I was born in the shadow of the end game. I am an artist. Art is an act of will in accord with a mature conscience. There can be no resignation. The artist is witness to existence itself. Art is the celebration. And I think if we can take that a bit more slowly and unpick some of these aphorisms, we may get to the heart of what Jeffery sees as the general relationship between the role of art and the artist to the immediate concerns and problems of the world in which we live. So first of all, he says, I was born in the shadow of the end game. Sure, born in 1945, not very different from my own date of birth. I understand what he's talking about here. The first use of nuclear weapons against Japan is something we've recently commemorated with President Obama's visit to Hiroshima, and also the initiation of a Cold War, which for 50 years dominated the politics of the world, underpinned by a massive nuclear capability on both sides, of course. And Jeffery remembers his school days in southern Ontario in the early 1950s. In those terms, the sirens going off to signal the practices, and the cynical teacher he told me about, who said, don't bother hiding under the desks, since no effective protection or escape was in fact now possible. But it was a situation where he says, in 1962, I received the Cuban Missile Crisis for my 17th birthday. We actually expected an annihilation at any time. London, Ontario was in the line of a continuous industrial belt from Illinois through Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, and upstate New York. Well, I was an undergraduate in Cambridge at that time, and I vividly recall that same sense. Only the sort of local context is different, and we would say to each other with a mixture of bravado, but some inner apprehension. So I'll see you on Friday, if there is a Friday. And I think people of my generation and Jeffrey's will well appreciate what is meant here. And those vivid memories, quite understandably, have lived with him, and the salience of the nuclear threat and has lived with him and is something to which he has often responded. In his mature view, it's the threat to use nuclear weapons, even if that threat is presented as a strategy to deter their actual use, that for Jeffery presents an affront to conscience. And what kind of protest, therefore, is evoked? Well, we know that Jeffery came from a wealthy business background that he's never repudiated. We know that his grandfather, as a Jewish immigrant from the Russian Pale, was formative influence here. The background of the family and their cultural identity is something that was explored, is explored in the chapter that Aaron Rosen will have in the forthcoming book. It's really unfortunate that Aaron cried off coming here, because Aaron has some very stimulating ideas on Jeffrey's sense of Jewish identity, views with which Jeffery cannot always find himself in agreement. But I want to take up one point from what Aaron develops in his chapter here, because it's really the paradigm behind Judaism, and indeed behind all the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that I think Aaron is most concerned to bring out here, because he sees Jeffery as strongly influenced by this, and in seeking a route to a pre-lapsarian past that can be recovered, some sort of re-entry to the Garden of Eden in a state of innocence. And what this actually reminded me of is the work of a Polish philosopher Leszek Kolakowski, who has written I think, very interesting history of Marxism, where he seeks to recover the sense behind Marxism of the paradigm of salvation here in a secularized sense. What he calls, in the term I had to look up in the dictionary in the first time, the soteriological fallacies. Soteriology is the branch of theology that is concerned with salvation here. And what Kolakowski calls the soteriological fallacy is the inbuilt axiom within all the Abrahamic religions that salvation is possible, is indeed the goal of humankind here. And what Kolakowski does in a way I found very stimulating is to show that this can be embodied too in Marxism in a secular sense, with the same promise of salvation to come here. So perhaps we can generalize Aaron Rosen's insight, or at least contention, about Jeffrey's thinking that it still bears the imprint of a Jewish identity by broadening that out from any possible sectarian or other restriction to Judaism. We can generalize the insight to apply not just to a specifically Jewish upbringing or outlook, as in Jeffrey's own case as a biographical fact, not just specifically Jewish, but to a cultural residue, as we might call it, in all the Abrahamic religions, which was then secularized by Marx in offering this quasi-religious prospect. And how far this is relevant in understanding Jeffrey's thinking is, to me at least, an interesting question, whether he has been engaged consciously and perhaps unconsciously too in a sort of lifelong quest on the assumption that some sort of epiphany leading to salvation in this more secular sense is indeed basic. Let's move on, though, in a rather more concrete way. He spent substantial periods in New York and Washington, D.C., but as we've already discussed, he retains a deep sense of Canadian identity, but strongly influenced by the American paradigm. He had connections with the old left in American politics. He was indeed present in the famous March on Washington in 1963.
No, I wasn't present. No. That's an error.
Oh, right. I misunderstood something here. But it's at any rate true that he was involved on the fringe of American politics, but that's not how he's chosen to define himself. He's not really a political figure. So we come to his second aphorism, which is deceptively simple. I am an artist. Of course he's an artist. We can all see that. We can see how his career built up in this way, and this was a serious commitment that I suggest by stages perhaps became a vocation. He In biographical terms, he had several, if not false starts, then attempts at doing different things in different ways. One significant staging point was clearly his time at the University of Oklahoma. I hope you agree with that bit.
Yes.
Oh,
I
good.
was there.
Oh,
I was there.
We're back on solid ground again. He says it was a dumb choice to go to Oklahoma, but clearly in terms of his results, it wasn't at all, because he may have gone there as a budding artist focused on developing his skills as a painter, but as he puts it himself, he came out as a sculptor. In his first semester, he realized he'd found his métier. Here, of course, working with steel, with a visceral thrill, he still vividly recalls, "I have come home." Look around you. And then the shopping centre in Ontario. Mark has dealt with that so well, I needn't say anything more about that. We come then to the pivotal significance of the third aphorism. Art is an act of will in accord with a mature conscience. Jeffrey's repeated this many times. It's a well-honed aphorism. It makes a certain sort of impact when we first hear it, but I think we have to think about it a bit more too. He's in his own exposition, the sort of things that he's written and said over the years, and that is collected in this very useful edition on Rubinoff on art. We get a number of hints of how to interpret this. He says art is existential to the artist, and his own career is certainly testimony to this. He's expressed his aesthetic through the techniques of sculpture, through the medium of steel, in a self-validating process. Yet he remains preoccupied with a concern for art's relationship with what he calls the existential realities of the artist's time, which themselves need to be addressed. What is art's value, he says at one point, if it fails to address these realities? What are these existential realities that the artist must, in his view, somehow address? He specifies three such realities. One is nuclear deterrence. We've already perhaps said enough about that to see why he would see it as so important. I've also mentioned the fact that he acknowledges a distinction between the threatened deployment of nuclear weapons, just as an act of foreign policy, the basis of the doctrine of nuclear deterrence, which of course many people justify as a means of peacekeeping, keeping the peace of the whole world, through a readiness, a proclaimed readiness at least, to use nuclear weapons, the distinction between that and their actual use. But Jeffrey's totally unimpressed by that distinction, I think. He says, no, it's enough that you purport to use them in that way. A further existential reality that Jeffrey specified is transgenic engineering, with which he's become increasingly concerned in recent years. And it's important to recognise here that what he is worried about is transgenic engineering on a way that changes the nature of species, whether they're vegetable species, animal species. He's not protesting against the use of stem cell research, for example, in modifying individuals, but he's worried about the general problem here. And he was clearly tempted at one point to add global warming as another existential reality of our time. And he dismisses that, not because he's not worried about it, not concerned about it, but on grounds that we might want to come back to. he doesn't finally include it in his own list because he calls this problem one that will eventually force a mass adaptation to the changed conditions. Now, I think what he must mean here is that it is so obviously a threat that, as you know, sensible, rational people will all come to terms with it. Well, just listen to at least one of the presidential candidates in the next election in the United States. I'm not sure the penny has yet dropped in the way that seems to imply, but again, perhaps that's something we can come back to. So what the actual third existential reality that he says we must address as an act of conscience, through an act of conscience, is that art itself is one of the three specified existential realities. Indeed, it's the one that when he makes these lists, he usually mentions first. And so he asks the question, can art become the fulcrum for the reconciliation of science with history to lever the value of conscience beyond the plasticity of morality? It's a very dense way of writing, of signalling this problem here. We perhaps need to think about it. It's a very high claim that Jeffery is making for art, but he's confident in making it precisely because his own career has exemplified not only a demanding conception of the value of art, but also a rigorous standard of artistic commitment. My perception of art, says Jeffery, and more than once, I think, is that it is an act of will in accordance with a mature conscience. Now, it's important to understand what Jeffery doesn't claim here. He's not advocating the artist should therefore become a propagandist or directly involved in politics. It is the art itself and the making of the art that is the act of mature conscience here. Art is not a means of conveying truths that have been arrived at through external processes of analysis or argument or experiment. What Jeffery says is art is self-contained truth. And he means by this that it's not an analogy for anything else, it's a metaphor. Now, we need to understand the difference, I think, between analogy and metaphor. I'll come back to that in a minute. But we've got as far now as point 3 in the aphorisms that Jeffery has put forward. Without wishing to minimise their importance at all, let me deal very quickly with 4, 5, and 6, just to clear the decks for getting back into what we've already developed here. Because it seems to me that we've already, I think, got most of the materials to hand in order to go forward. The 4th aphorism is there can be no resignation. I think that's covered by what we've said about conscience, isn't it? As I understand it, it's the call to conscience, the priority of conscience. That means there must be no resignation. Yeah. The 5th aphorism is about art giving direct access to knowledge as a metaphor. And this is what I'm going to come back to when he says the artist is witness to existence itself. And the final aphorism is that art is to be understood as an existential act. It's a heavy moral obligation, but as the way he puts this final aphorism, it's also got an uplifting sense. He says, art is the celebration. So that's the complete roster of the 6 aphorisms that Jeffery has time and again presented and by which he stands, so far as I know, unless he's changed his mind quite recently. Now, they're all stated by him in as an admirably pithy way. That's my only excuse for lingering to dig out more of the meaning behind them for those of us who are rather more slower-witted than Jeffery himself. And they constitute a testament rather than a series of verifiable propositions that would be open to scientific refutation. As Jeffery put it in 2008, art provides a means to experience the sacred beyond prescriptive narrative. And perhaps that's part of the justification for what I earlier referred to as this soteriological sort of quest that Aaron Rosen and I would put in different terms, but both of us, I think, perhaps identify in Jeffrey's assumptions here. He says the same thing, essentially, I think, the same thing in slightly different ways. In 2010, he said, art is the map of the human soul. It's a high but not an exclusive claim, for if art is in itself a profound source of knowledge, it's not the only one. Science is truth by analogy, is how Jeffery put it in 2011. Art is truth by metaphor. These are very important claims. So he talks of their mutual resonance, that they are each giving us a path to knowledge, but a path of a rather different kind, because the point is that art makes its impact immediately in the same way that a metaphor does, in describing one thing in terms that are transferred from another, suggesting an intuitive correspondence that's instantly enlightening. Asking someone to explain a metaphor is rather like asking someone to explain a joke. You know, if you don't get it, it hasn't worked somehow. It may be your fault, it may be the metaphor's fault, it may be the joke's fault, but, you know, you're not going to get it by having it explained to you in that way. Now, science is different from art, fundamentally different, epistemologically different from art, says Jeffery, because although it's no less directed towards seeking truths, it proceeds in a totally different way. Insights may be generated intuitively. We know that great scientists work in that way. They have a hunch, and then they want to go further. That may be the beginning, because those hunches in science need then to be confirmed through orderly procedures establishing degrees of correspondence in formal ways, and thus brought to some sort of proof which can be more generally and objectively agreed to. And this is the essence of analogy, because analogy specifies quite tightly the common conditions on the assumptions that if things have certain similar attributes, other attributes will also be similar. All of those links are tight logical links, and you need them, really, if an analogy is truly a good analogy. But for a metaphor to work, it works just like that. You hear it, like just as when you hear the joke, you laugh. If you hear the metaphor, you may smile, but you may be amused, but actually it's worked inside your brain. It's made that link. And Jeffery is claiming that that is how art works, and that is how the kind of knowledge that art conveys has this unique capacity and cannot simply be translated into other terms. So in terms of his own sense of the map of knowledge, it follows that his theories about science and history have a different status and cannot simply command axiomatic acceptance. His ideas about history, I will say less about. I've gone on for long enough, I think. But they are important. They have a more recent origin in the late 1980s, starting from the insight that the power of a warrior class depends upon the strategic control of land. And it's this that formed the basis for Jeffrey's idea of the age of agriculture as having a fundamental importance for us, a prolonged epoch during which land warfare had been endemic, dependent on agriculture, because as soon as you have agriculture, as soon as you are tilling the land and growing crops, you need to protect them so that it's you that harvests them and not some other fellow who suddenly comes along. They need protection, which only a warrior class could provide. But the warrior class, funnily enough, were not totally disinterested here. They considered the point, what's in it for us? And part of the price of this protection was endemic warfare. This is the link. This is why the age of agriculture and war are integrally connected here. Now, a lot of people say, yeah, well, that's all pretty obvious because war's always been with us. But no, says Jeffrey, it hasn't always been with us. This is where we've got to make a return visit to a place we've already mentioned several times, the caves at Chauvet. The discovery of the cave paintings at Chauvet in 1994 showed that this art had been executed some 35,000 years ago. And to Jeffrey, this was an important moment because it suggested that the evidence of artistic endeavour preceded any evidence of organised warfare. As he told the 2010 forum, though the caves have yielded evidence of great art, they yield no evidence of war. Now, of course, historians will have problems here in wondering whether the fact that nothing that we can regard as evidence of war means that there hadn't previously been war. Jeffrey, I think, admits that his contention here will be vulnerable to empirical disproof, but he doesn't think that's happened so far. As he reads it, in this history of art, war is not inevitable, it's an existential choice. War came along when we had the age of agriculture. But we're not still living in the age of agriculture because technology moved on and the age of agriculture, with its need for a warrior class, depended on territorial control of the land. But in Jeffrey's view, in the Second World War and onward, the strategic use of air power meant that we've moved out of the era where territorial control of that kind is still the main point. It can be done otherwise. So initially it sounds like good news, perhaps. Oh no, we're not doing justice here to Jeffrey's more gloomy insights. Oh no, he says, because what's happened is that the old warlords have now been replaced by the new ones, the military-industrial complex of which President Eisenhower warned in his farewell presidential address in 1961. The world of Dr. Strangelove, not coincidentally one of Jeffrey's favourite movies. And just as nuclear deterrence is one of his preoccupations, so the systemic impact of transgenic engineering illuminates for him the frightening dimensions and possibility of a world that has moved on the back of big science beyond the age of agriculture, and it's not necessarily good news. On that sombre note, at 12:30, I will conclude.
Thank you, Peter. That was as witty as it was thought-provoking, and I'm sure there are lots of comments and questions. Jeffrey, I think, is going to start them.
Yeah, there's two parts which I think is really important and that I made notes on. I will make a categorical statement, and I'll relate to why and how I've made this one. There's no salvation in art. And that's a conclusion that I reached at one point. And I had a conversation with Alan Antliff, especially about Joseph Beuys. And this has to do with the concept that art is an act of will in accord with a mature conscience. And that became really aware of this at about the age of 19, and on a reading from Simone de Beauvoir, who we quote at the beginning of the book as well. This concept of a mature conscience is very different than Heidegger's view of a conscience. His view of it is that it tells you what not to do, and if you're going to become the superhuman being that he became and fire your own mentor, because he happened to have been Jewish, is Heidegger's downfall. And that part is that you overcome your conscience, and therefore that is a statement of strength. My argument is that's a statement of a supreme weakness. And that's one of the aspects of the importance of art itself, which means that the act of will means that you're very, very conscious of your conscience, and that as you move through life, you actually make very strong you actually make very strong commitments based on your conscience, quite the reverse of Heidegger's view of conscience. So one of the conversations that I had with Alan was that he wrote on Joseph Beuys. And Joseph Beuys, as a young man, the same age as me, I would say, when I went to undergraduate school and had this realization, chose to become a Stuka pilot and fight in the Crimea. And the Stuka was a very ugly plane. It was a terrible flying plane. So anyone in combat, air-to-air combat, would be shot down like a flea. But it was used to terrorize. It was an instrument of terror. And so when he fought in the Crimea, the Germans were terrible in that war in the Crimea, and the Crimea has come up again. The big surprise was that the Crimea ever passed back to the Ukraine. The Crimea and Sebastopol were very famous battles, but it was in the Battle of Kursk, finally, that the Germans were turned back. That was a huge one. But to actually choose at the age of 19, at the time when I was having an experience of this question of conscience and the meaning of conscience at that point, to choose to be a Stuka pilot was to choose to drive the instrument of terror. And so I really questioned whether or not, when he came back to art, that particular question really is one that I think will become a topic in our future here, as to whether or not art itself can be perceived as salvation. I say no. And that was the most exemplary attitude towards it. I think, the great support, and we're back to the question of nationalism, the great support of Joseph Beuys was the fact that Germany was looking for salvation from 1945 on, and Joseph Beuys represented that part of what the German actual zeitgeist at that point really needed in order to, just really needed it at that point. And so that question between Heidegger's choice, and I'm sure he made a Heidegger's choice when he made the choice to become a Stuka pilot. I mean, you had to volunteer for that. Nobody went out and said, "We're drafting you, you're going to become a Stuka pilot." This was an actual, very self-conscious act on his part. So the question of salvation, no, I don't think there is salvation in art. That's exactly my point. So if we were going to go against the Abrahamic religions, I would say art, there's no salvation. Not on that definition of.
What a shame we haven't got air in here for
Absolutely, absolutely. The other thing is I wanted to put in once more, especially for the new students, this explanation about deterrence. Our understanding of deterrence, of course, is just a Mexican standoff. You know, I hold a gun to your head, you hold a gun to my head. Sounds so neat and so clean. The question that was that by the late 1950s was that both America and Soviet Union were locked into a process called mutually assured destruction, which became the MAD doctrine. And that meant that whoever fired the first weapon, would bring this thing to mutual destruction. And even at that time, the amount of nuclear weapons that we have now, just as a secondary thing after all the peace agreements, 1962 looks like a very, very small entity in terms of this. The problem of mutually assured destruction was thought through by a person by the name of Herman Kahn. He said, this is a far more dangerous world because what happens if it accidentally starts? Where does it end? And how do we end it? And so he wrote a book on thermonuclear war in 1959, and this is the most important part to understand because in the terms of the difference between conscience and morality, that exists within this particular structure, the structure of deterrence and the truth about deterrence. So you have to take the truth about deterrence as well as just nice idea, we'll build up our weaponry so that there's mutually assured destruction. The problem with that particular argument, as he points out, is if it accidentally starts, it's got to go to its final end. Okay, now we ask the next question. Let's say it accidentally starts. A madman on the trigger. I mean, that's what Dr. Strangelove was about. He poses the problem, which has become the essence of deterrence, is how to bring it to an end. And the best part that he could come up with is lex talionis, which is an eye for an eye, which means that the war will continue until both sides decide that they've had enough. And so that you keep retaliating until it stops. There's no guarantee it will ever stop. But the difference here is let's just look at what it means in a microcosm. Let's say the microcosm is accidentally New York is destroyed. A weapon gets through. And we're talking about 1959, so we're not talking about great sophisticated weapons. We're talking about things that were big, ugly, and directed over an area. Now, I need to point out that strategic bombing in World War II started out with destroying the other side's way of making war. Now, that sounds like a simple proposition. Destroy their ball bearing plants, for example. They can't roll anymore. And that's how it started. That's not the way it ended. And it's been pointed out that by the end of World War II, strategic bombing meant destroying the other countries' cities, because after all, that's where the industry was. You wiped out the entire city. So by the end of the war, we have the firebombing of Tokyo, where 100,000 are killed, and I think 1,500 bombers did it. 2 750 bomber sorties were done by the British in order to create the firestorm in Dresden. So that was over 2 days to do that. So what the atomic bomb did is it said, well, one bomber can do all of this work. Now, what that means is that we now have the accidental destruction of a major city, say New York. What Herman Kahn asked the best thinkers of the time who would make these decisions, how would you retaliate? And almost invariably they would say, destroy Moscow. That was the wrong answer. But just answering the question, being forced into the position of actually answering the question was his point. Because the minute that you do, you've just separated conscience from morality. Now, he doesn't say that, but I say that. Because you are morally compelled to bring this war to an end, and the only way that you can do it as President of the United States, the only way you're going to be able to do it is transacting in megadeath. And so you have two choices. Once it starts, take it to one city, 2 cities, 3 cities, doesn't matter, but you're now transacting a megadeath, and that is your moral compulsion. You must do that. Now, that's very different than conscience. Conscience says, so, in other words, we've entered a period of time where the logic, by 1960s, 61, 62, the logic of deterrence, which sounds at its surface a moral statement, which it is no longer a conscionable statement. And that separates morality from conscience. Why is that so important? When we look to transgenic engineering, if I'm right, and I'm very positive about it, that conscience is something that is part of our genome, and clusters of genes that make up conscience are part of our genome, then it is so easy to inadvertently exchange moral purpose. And the moral purpose would be, and there's no question in my mind, that there will be a clear moral purpose and argument for transgenic engineering. We'll be able to get rid of bladder cancer, for example. But the results are unknown. And the unknown results are the separation between this moral compulsion, which is exactly what deterrence is, and the question of the disposition of conscience in 50 years, 100 years, or 200 years. Now, that's very, very important in terms of what we needed to learn from the Second World War and from the post-war period. This part hasn't been examined. So this is one of the things that I bring up, because that's what the concept of an active will in accord with a mature conscience will lead to, and into this kind of thinking. So I just want to say that.
Thank you, Jeffrey. So we've probably only got about 5 or so minutes left. So we've got a question from you, and then Vid afterwards.
Thank you so much, Peter. I have a question for Jeffrey. So if art is an act of will, how do you tie this up with ending a series? How do you realize that now a series needs an ending and a new one to begin?
Well, I think that was explained yesterday. You perceive that you've still got another piece to do, right? And when you perceive that you still have another piece to do, and you perceive that you can't perceive of a piece after that piece, then you never build that piece. That piece.
It's intuitive.
Yeah, it's intuitive.
Do you still work on the idea of that piece that you're not?
No, because I think what each series is doing is setting up a different structure of language that you've learned from the previous series. So you're now searching for that new structure of language. Yeah. The important part here is that each piece is almost like a Hegelian argument in history. So you are actually proposing an argument of history. Each series is a continuous set because you can't resolve the questions of that particular argument until the end of it. So you're going through a Hegelian process of antithesis and synthesis again until such time as you realize you've covered the argument. The argument covers itself, and now you move on to the next one.
Vid? We've got a couple of minutes. I mean, if there's anyone who would like to ask Peter any questions, I feel that Peter has been abandoned here.
Sorry.
I had a question.
You've got a question for Peter. You go on. I have a question for Jeffrey.
I have a question for Peter. Peter, you use the term salvation. I'm not familiar enough with religion to know what that exactly means. It sounds like it means some fantastical thing in some other realm where you float around and it's all utopian. Is that what you mean, or do you mean it more in an abstract sense, sort of a more practical utopia, like a Marxist type of place?
Well, I was trying to suggest that there was an affinity here between particularly the Abrahamic religions and also a secularized version of the same promise, if you like, held out by Marxism, in the sense that we can transcend the limitations of our sinful life hitherto, embodied in Marxist terms in capitalism, by moving to a situation of permanent, of perfect freedom, which would indeed then be the kingdom of heaven here on earth. There was that strong correspondence between the secular and the truly religious, more literal terms of the claim, where salvation implies that it will be in a future life in heaven or otherwise.
One of the things I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but what I see in Jeffrey's work is that he always emphasizes this idea of artist as a witness, and even just in the aesthetics of the work and the way that it's laid out in the park, it's very much embedded in nature, in the processes of nature, and in witnessing the unfolding of life, both within the park, within the work, within the evolution of his ideas. And it doesn't seem to me that this idea of a transcendent reference point really enters into the work at all. It seems like the sense of the sacred is really present. It's always present tense. So I don't really see that the sense of the sacred needs a transcendent referent at all. I mean, it's Jay Winter had this idea of minor and major utopias, and I think we explored it, a little bit when he was here. That the utopia is that no place that you sort of you imagine and you set up in your longings.
Point taken, Karun, on that. But again, I'm going to take the coward's way out and put my head down and say, well, it's really Aaron Rosen you're belabouring over the head at this point in his essay, where he makes this claim in a stronger form for Jeffrey. Yeah.
Please.
This may be a question which, in the same way, the author is now absent. David spoke yesterday about the action of an artist or an artist's decision to be either a farmer or a warrior. And I was puzzled by that. I'm interested by that. And I think it was a quote from you. I think it was a response that you had chosen to be a warrior. Is this true?
I don't think one person chooses. No. I think that... I would have to say no, that's not the issue of the question of art in the way that I've looked at it from this point of view. I look at the artist in the artist's eye as hunter. Hunter. That's a very different role. The role of transition. There's a very interesting transition because we've had other forums on this, on the origins of warfare, and it starts to show in the Neolithic period, which just happens to be the birth of agriculture at the same time. But Neolithic art, very different from Paleolithic art, shows skirmishes with bows and arrows and shows organized warfare. And that was a couple of years ago, we had an author by the name of Arthur Farrell who writes about this early war and agreed with me that in Paleolithic art, and he doesn't see a history of warfare in Paleolithic time. So we're going from about 50,000 years ago in the transition into Europe, to leaving Africa and Europe, to the period of about 13,000 to 10,000 years ago. And what shows up in Neolithic art is very active looking and very interesting looking, but it depicts actual skirmishes between warriors. So there's a very big difference between a hunter and a warrior. There has to be a social transition in here. And no, I've never really seen myself with that social transition. But of course, the warrior class would grow out of the hunter class too, right? One would assume that, right? That the aggressiveness that's there.
Thank you.
Vid, I think you had one. Are you sure?
Yeah, I'll ask Peter during the break.
Okay. Well, that's fantastic. Well, does anyone else wants to ask a question, a brief question or anything? No?
Can I ask a question of Jeffrey? Just briefly, because it doesn't seem like they've quite set up a lunch yet. I'm just wondering, you mentioned, both Peter and Jeffrey, you mentioned this division between analogy and metaphor and how science is one way of knowing through analogy. I suppose more the hard science side of it, and how the knowledge in art functions through metaphor. And as I've been exposed to the kinds of ways in which maybe I would say British or the English school of thought around history and international politics flows, they gravitate a lot more to the use and value of metaphor in understanding and talking about human relations on all kinds of levels. So the humanities, which we didn't bring in, actually employs a lot of metaphor as a way of talking about it, but it's not necessarily distinctly art. And I'm wondering if, Jeffrey, you had thought about the humanities and not necessarily just the fine arts as also really profiting from metaphor as a way of getting to this knowledge.
I think that of course is part of what's there. The humanities can't exist without a logical argument and without an analogical argument. That's the issue of the two. I would say that, from a sculptor's point of view, I can't exist without analogical arguments either. I mean, that's what I have to put into each piece. It's the dominance of metaphorical truth that makes a work of art, not the dominance of the ability to do analogies. And I think that back in the 1990s when Hofstadter was really kind of popular, he wanted to redefine intelligence as the ability to do analogies because that would allow computers to be smart. So if you were willing to accept that analogies is intelligence and the ability to do analogies is there, then it becomes easy to transition into artificial intelligence. And what we're looking at, and we truthfully are, is there's a great alarm going up with Bill Gates and Stephen Hawking in Cambridge on the danger of artificial intelligence. But I've never seen it as that dangerous. It's only dangerous by definition. If it has the ability to define intelligence based on the ability to do analogy, then of course it is. But what it did in proving that Big Blue could beat, I guess it was Kasparov. Was it Kasparov who Big Blue finally beat? I think so. In doing so, all that it did was relegate chess to an analogy game. And chess grew out of the idea that it was a metaphor. So what Big Blue did was reduce the argument to that particular game, which was looked at metaphorically, and just reduced it to the ability to do analogy. And it outdid him in analogies. He could look down the road much, much farther than he could.
Just going back to your point, Karun, about art and metaphor, the fact that I think Jeffrey would claim that all art is metaphor doesn't imply that all metaphor is art.
Yeah, that's true. It's not reversible.
Yeah.
And without the ability to do analogies, there would be no art. So there is an ability to do analogies, but we've gone through the argument in the last 20 years as to what intelligence is, and if we can define it in terms of IQ tests and the ability to do analogies, then you're going to end up with Big Blue beating Kasparov in a game that was essentially a metaphor prior to that actually defeat.